Welcome to the National Women's Fitness Academy podcast. We're here to talk about women's health, female hormones, body image, and all things health and fitness.
Hello, girls, and welcome back to another episode of the Women's Fitness Academy's podcast. I'm your host, Siggy, one of the WFA's educators and a women's health and confidence coach. As I say every time you come on here and you listen to me or you're watching me, I need you to tune into this episode because this is going to blow your mind, because this lovely lady blew my mind when I read her book. I want to introduce Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, who is a certified fertility awareness educator and a holistic reproductive health practitioner who is teaching women to chart their menstrual cycles for natural birth control, conception, and monitoring overall health. Now, in her best-selling book, if you haven't bought it yet, make sure that you put that on your wish list, The Fifth Vital Sign. Now, this book, Lisa debunks the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children by organizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. Now, drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to fertility awareness and menstrual cycle optimization. She also hosts her own podcast called the Fertility Friday Podcast, which is a weekly radio show devoted to helping women connect with their fifth vital sign by uncovering the connection between the menstrual cycle health, fertility, overall health, and so much more. Lisa, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. I want us to start off by letting our clients, letting our listeners know what is the vital sign and why should we consider the menstrual cycle as a vital sign?
Well, I mean, a vital sign is simply a measure of how our body is functioning. And so we're all pretty much familiar with the common vital signs, which would be like our body temperature or heart rate or blood pressure, the number of breaths that we take per minute, those kinds of things. And I think we all know that if you go to the doctor and they're testing your vitals, like those signs I mentioned, we know that there's a certain range that is considered normal. And if you are outside of that range, like if your blood pressure is too high, for example, it's not just a random piece of information. It tells the doctor not only that something is wrong, but it tells them where to look, because he knows that there's a handful of things that would specifically potentially, trigger high blood pressure. So it almost provides that roadmap where you know where to start looking. And in a similar way, when we understand the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, we can understand that there would be a normal range for a variety of things. Now, it's interesting because when I say the menstrual cycle is a vital sign, and we look at the range, often people think of just the period. But when we break the menstrual cycle down into its parts, we're looking at the overall length. We are looking at the period, like the quality of the menstruation and how long it is and all those things, and the volume and etc. But the period is only one part of it. We're also looking at the first half of the cycle as we approach ovulation. How long is it? Are you seeing cervical fluid? What is that looking like? Are you ovulating? We're looking at the second half of the cycle. How long is that? What are you seeing during that time? So there's a number of different factors we can pay attention to. And within that whole picture, there is a whole lot that we can gather. I mean, from something as basic as identifying a yeast infection by paying attention to your cervical mucus pattern, if you're seeing some sort of discharge all the time, knowing that that's not normal and being able to pick up something as simple as a yeast infection, to something more serious, where if you stop menstruating altogether, that could be a sign of hypothalamic amenorrhea and could be reflecting, a series of behaviors, including undereating and overexercise and things like that. So that's the kind of intro into it. And after we talk about it, it's just such a basic concept. But I think for many of us, we're not taught anything about our menstrual cycle. So it just, afterwards, it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But it's such a revolutionary way to look at our periods.
And I'm sure you've taught, hundreds of thousands of women around this. And I would love to know, like, what got you teaching this? Like, what was the point in your life or your health journey where you're like, I need to know more of this and I want to teach others do this too?
Well, try to, keep it brief, but I first discovered fertility awareness shortly out of high school. So I had been on the pill a little bit when I was maybe, let's say, 15, 16, because I had heavy periods. They were really painful and I was super active. I was, doing ballet dancing and track and field and stuff like that. So, no one wants to be in a leotard and like bleeding extra heavily with all the pains. So at that age, most of us don't really know what else to do. So girls talk, and I went on the pill because I heard that it makes your periods lighter. And so interestingly, in my experience though, because I was not, sexually active at that time, I wasn't taking it for birth control. I would sometimes not take it at the right time or like forget to take it. And I read the insert and it would be like, oh, if you miss one, take two and whatever. So I played that whole game. But what I found was every now and then, because I was a child, I would go on it and then my periods would be better. And then I'd be like, oh, I'm fixed. So then I would come off of it because I'm fixed, right? And then every time I came off, my period would come back just as bad or worse as it was before. So even though I didn't have the language to describe it, I caught on that it wasn't the same thing as my period. So I was kind of primed for that. So then when I actually did become sexually active, I was like the opposite of most women. I was actually distrustful of the pill because I had always taken it at the wrong time. Like I knew I wasn't remembering all of that. I had read the insert and I felt like the whole time I was on the pill, I would just be stressed about like missing it or being 5 minutes late or whatever. And so then I would have used condoms every time anyways. And as such, I decided just to go with the condoms and try to figure out what the heck was wrong with my periods. Because even though I didn't have the language, I didn't feel like it was normal for it to be so painful. And I kind of wanted to figure out what that was about. And it was right around that time that I discovered fertility awareness. So I started charting. It was a whole thing. I, discovered that I wasn't fertile every day. That was really exciting. I discovered that I could use that method for birth control. And so, in addition to my condom plan, I now was empowered to chart my cycle and know which days were fertile and not. So, I was a lot more confident in terms of like my choices. So, when I was using the condoms in the fertile window, I was really motivated to use them correctly. And I feel like it really informed that choice to kind of use that as a non-hormonal kind of option. So that was my 20s. Like I was using the method. I joined a group who was teaching and I took a training course and we were doing it super grassroots movement locally, but I didn't really think that I would be able to have a career in that. So your question was, what motivated me to finally do this in a more of a big way? And it really was when I had my first son. So when I, got married, had my first son, he was born the day after my 30th birthday. And so it was at that time that I really started to think a little bit deeper about it. I mean, I had been able to chart my cycles. I had identified some issues through charting. I had issues with my thyroid that I was able to identify. And through that time, I was able to kind of take for granted this knowledge. And after, a decade of being able to take that knowledge for granted, and teaching some women along the way, the world hadn't really changed. And most women still didn't know about this. And I was starting to see how big of an issue, especially infertility, was becoming. And again, how big of a problem is it that your average woman doesn't even know how to tell when she's ovulating, right? So that was really what motivated me to kind of get my megaphone, so to speak, and start putting it out there to see if anybody was interested in what I had to say. And so it turns out, like, yes, they were.
It's so good. For some reason, in my mind, I don't know if you follow this page on Instagram. It's a dude with a sign with a carton box, and he just writes stuff. And I feel as if like you'd be in the middle of the street going, "Oh, why do I have fireworks behind me?"
That is oh my gosh, is he even listening to us?
Oh my God, that was so weird. But holding a sign and going, the menstrual cycle, or like, don't skip your menstrual cycle, or the pill is not a real bleed, or so many myths that women still need to learn these days. And you mentioned a couple of good points before, that you first went onto the pill because you were experiencing heavy bleeds. And I know a lot of women can relate to this. I can relate to this, much so. And also from going on a pill due to having acne, having acne, it'll clear your skin, you'll be all fine. But then, as you said, like once you came off the pill, you just realize the symptoms were still there. Nothing was really fixed per se. And you mentioned also around your ovulation, when you were tracking it, you weren't fertile every day. I used to have this constant fear that if I was going to have sex, whether it was protected or not, that I was going to get pregnant. And this is something, again, that needs to be spoken a little bit more. So with your expertise, would you mind telling our listeners what is that fertile window and how can they start tracking this better with fertility awareness?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that was huge for me because I remember learning in, the junior high sex ed class. They basically told us we were fertile all the time. There was no safe days, your period every single day. And it's actually kind of the opposite because as women, we have a window of time. And so, how we identify that window, if you are paying attention to your cycle and you're not currently on hormonal contraceptives, the way the cycle works is that you have your period. And then, as your period is kind of wrapping up, that's around the time that your ovaries start to prepare for ovulation. And so, as you approach ovulation, what's happening in the ovaries is that there's a number of small follicles that start to develop. And eventually, one of those follicles is essentially chosen and it develops and then results in ovulation, ends up ovulating. And so during this time, the follicle as it's developing, they're releasing estrogen. Estrogen has a lot of interesting effects on the menstrual cycle. And so a lot of the signs that we are observing, if you're charting your cycle, such as cervical fluid production, and some of the other changes that we observe, those are caused by that estrogen as you're approaching ovulation. And so that period of time when, if you're paying attention to your cervical fluid, so if you've never learned about it before, it can look like clear, like raw egg whites. Like if you were to think of raw egg whites, clear and stretchy. It can also look like creamy white hand lotion. And so many of the listeners may have noticed this. I know when I think back, I did notice cervical mucus when I was a teenager, but obviously I didn't know that terminology and I had no idea what it was. So I remember going to my mom and I don't remember what I said, but something like, what's going on? Like my underwear's all wet. And she basically just told me to wear panty liners. She's kind of like, yeah, just wear panty liners. And that was the conversation because that's what she knew to tell me. And so for anybody who's ever just paid attention, you might just notice that there's some days that you actually feel really wet. Like you might even think your period has started and you go to the bathroom and there's no period and you're kind of like, what was that about? And you might even notice as you're walking around through the day, there's just some days where it's just wetter down there. Or you might notice that you go to the bathroom and you wipe yourself and maybe you have to wipe a couple of times. It's just kind of you're wiping off the slippery stuff. Or it's actually really slippery and I always joke that your hand is hitting the back of the toilet. So if you've ever noticed any of those kinds of signs, but you obviously like you're living your life, like you notice it, but you don't necessarily know what it is, you're not necessarily paying attention to it, those are some of the ways that your cervical fluid shows up. So that cervical fluid is how you identify your fertile window, because as you approach ovulation, the estrogen is triggering that mucus production. And the mucus is really interesting because it helps the sperm to survive for up to 5 days. So many of us have heard, oh, the sperm can live in your body for 5 days, but there's no context given. It's not just all the time. It's only when we're in that fertile window that the sperm can survive. Actually, when you're not in the fertile window and you don't have that cervical mucus, your body, your vagina is actually quite acidic. And there's a different type of plug that blocks your cervix that actually prevents the sperm from doing anything. And in that acidic environment, they die, within minutes. So that is kind of like, cervical mucus 101, just starting to identify that there are days where you're making it. And those days are associated with fertility because another way to look at it is there's different words for cervical mucus and this whole concept of, fertility in the fertile window. And one of the ways that the cervical mucus is referred to is as like a biological valve or as nature's gate. And I use the silly analogy of like a bouncer in a nightclub. And so if you think about a bouncer in a nightclub, it's like if the bouncer is there, you're not getting in, right? Maybe he's meanie or whatever. But then when he goes out for a little snack or dinner or whatever, then you can go in. It's the same way. So in the fertile window, the cervical mucus is flowing and the cervix is therefore open. And so the sperm, when you have sex during that time, are free to enter into the cervix, swim up into the uterine, uterine cavity and, wait in the fallopian tubes to wait for the egg. So they just have kind of free range. But outside of that window, there is a thick mucus plug that blocks it and they can't get in. This is very helpful information because when you're living your life and if you're sexually active, it means that you don't have to be afraid all the time. And this was something that was great when I first learned fertility awareness training, because I was already planning to be scared all the time because that's what I had been taught to do. But when I learned that I could actually identify, when I was fertile, and that there was actually times that I can. It's so funny because if this is the first time some of your listeners have heard this, I mean, I've had clients who, when we talk about it in class, and I say, okay, so there are times in the cycle where pregnancy is not possible. Like if you were to have unprotected sex, and I have to like sometimes be very explicit, like if your partner were to ejaculate inside of your body, you would not get pregnant. And I've had clients who are kind of like, I mean, I heard you say that, but like, you mean like really? And so this is basic biology that you can study. And I think the interesting part about it is that you wouldn't think that there's, especially when you're hearing for the first time, like you wouldn't think that there's so much science behind it. Um, so I will pause there because of course I could talk about these things all day, but hopefully that answers the question in terms of how to identify that window.
It definitely does. And I know it's so helpful for many of us because, like you said, when we were younger, we didn't know this. We were like stressed out if we were going to get pregnant, whether we were like getting our partners to wear condoms or protection or whatsoever. And a common question that I do come across is we know now that we have that 5-day fertility after ovulation. What are the consequences, or is there a chance of getting pregnant during your period? It's something that comes up.
Well, so the fertile window from a scientific perspective is the 5 days leading up to ovulation and ovulation day itself. So when we look at studies, and there's different ways to look at it, but there's one study that had couples have sex at different times of the cycle and track it. And they found that pregnancy only occurred when the sex happened during the 5 days leading up to ovulation and the day of it. But ovulation is variable. So ovulation can happen earlier or later in the cycle. So we're kind of under the impression that all menstrual cycles are 28 days all the time, and that ovulation happens on day 14 all the time. But when you actually track your cycle, there's quite a bit of variability. So some women ovulate earlier. They may ovulate on day 12 or day 11, or day 10 even. And other women may ovulate on day, whatever it is, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Some ovulate on day 43. In my upcoming book, I have an example of a chart, and she ovulates, I think it's on day 65. That was a PCOS cycle. So that's obviously outside of what we would consider to be normal, but I give that example to show that it is quite variable. And so then to answer the question of, is it possible to get pregnant from sex on your period? So the answer is yes, it's possible. But if we go into why that is, it's not because you would be ovulating and having your period at the same time. So what can happen in a shorter cycle when ovulation is happening earlier in the cycle is for anyone who's had a period before, you will have noticed that you typically start moderate to heavy when you actually start that true flow. So there's a couple of days of active bleeding. And then once those days of active bleeding are kind of mostly over, you still finish bleeding, but I mean, you could probably relate to this, right? Like after those days of active bleeding, the bleeding kind of starts to taper off, right? So then, and then eventually you might get to that day where you have a little light bleeding, or maybe even a little bit of like residual spotting or something like that until it stops. So what can happen is if you're having a short cycle, first of all, you don't have a little newscaster in your body that's going to come to you and be like, okay, so this month you're going to like, right? Like that's not how it works. So you wouldn't necessarily be given a heads up ahead of time. So when you're charting your cycle, what I encourage my clients to do is start checking for mucus on a daily basis. If someone is using this method for birth control, we would actually be instructing them to check for mucus and start checking. You can't really check for mucus when you have heavy or moderate bleeding because you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference. Like if there's all this blood, like how are you supposed to tell? So you can really only start checking for mucus on the light days or very light days, like once it's starting to taper off. And so we would encourage our clients to do that, because what can happen is if ovulation is happening a bit earlier, that means the follicular development is happening a bit earlier. So if those ovaries start developing those eggs earlier and those follicles are releasing estrogen, and that estrogen is triggering cervical fluid, it is possible that you could start having cervical fluid on those light and very light days of your period. And so when you hear about someone who got pregnant, quote, on their period, what the most likely explanation is that they started to produce mucus during those latter days of their period. They had sex and the sperm was able to survive for that 5-day window, and they had an early ovulation. So in that scenario, they might have ovulated on day 10, 11, day 12, or whatever it is, depending on the length of their period. And so this, in terms of the method itself, I mean, you're not going to listen to today's podcast and be like, okay, I'm using fertility rights method. For anybody who wants to use the method, like it's just like learning to drive or something like that. Like you need to take a little bit of time. You need to learn about how it works, the rules, take a couple cycles to chart and learn what you're doing. I highly recommend you consider working with an instructor if you really want to rely on the method for birth control so that you can learn the ins and outs of it. It's not something we have to be afraid of. It's just something we have to be aware of, and we need to have the strategies for how to deal with it.
It's so fascinating that we're talking about fertility awareness, because I still find that it's spoken a lot about, like in our space, we speak about it a lot. I still do find that many women still don't have an understanding of it, but I'm hoping that, within the next 5-10 years, it will definitely change the importance for women and how to be able to navigate their optimal health around the menstrual cycle. You mentioned a couple of times about like the natural way of charting, but also in regarding to the hormonal birth control. And too often with women is they are wanting to conceive in the future. However, they are taking hormonal birth control as well. What are the common side effects that you've noticed when someone is wanting to conceive, but they are associated with the hormonal contraception?
Mm-hmm. So I think there might be two parts to that answer. I mean, the most common side effects associated with hormonal birth control would be, sexual side effects like low libido, that kind of thing, and also mood side effects, like depression and anxiety and things like that. So those may not directly relate to fertility in the moment because those are side effects that many women experience while they're still taking it. So many women do experience, it's kind of ironic because you're going on this pill so that you can have sex. And so many women find that they're on the pill and they have a lower sex drive. And there's research to show some women may also experience not only low sex drive, but less of a sensation or feeling. The scary stats show studies where one of the ways that the pill works is it shuts down ovarian function. So most combined synthetic estrogen and progestin combinations, the primary mode of action is to shut down ovulation, because obviously if you're not ovulating, you can't conceive. So that's makes it highly effective. And then the secondary effects are to dry up that cervical mucus that we were talking about and to thin the uterine lining so that if something were to break through, it's unlikely that it would be able to implant. But when you shut down ovarian function, what you're shutting down as well is you're shutting down your natural estrogen and progesterone production. I mean, obviously that's what's going to happen when you're going to shut down ovarian function. That's necessary in order for the birth control pill to be effective. But what also happens is that when you shut down ovarian function, it also lowers our testosterone production. And then when our body has an influx of synthetic estrogen and progestins, it also reduces our overall testosterone. So there's a series of events that happen that significantly reduce our free testosterone. And this has a profound effect on many women in terms of their libido and also their vulvar tissues. So the scary stat that I mentioned is that the pill is associated with shrinking the clitoris and thinning vulvar tissues. Again, I don't know that there's evidence to show that these effects are permanent, but certainly I always say, like, if there was evidence to show that there was a pill that would shrink a man's penis, by like, there was one study that showed like an average of 20% reduction in size. I mean, that's terrifying, right? And I don't know that many men that would sign up for it. And then in terms of the mood side effects, the depression, anxiety, and things like that, the sad part is that many women are never told about these side effects. So the issue from my perspective is just that a lot of women kind of suffer, but maybe they went on the pill when they were 14 or 15 or whatever, so they wouldn't have had the opportunity to kind of know themselves in that way. So they might just think, I'm just not that sexual of a person, or I'm just not that happy of a person. I've heard people say this. And I mean, that's the tragic part. So in terms of your question though, how could it affect fertility? One of the things I like to just share, I think it's helpful for us to hear different perspectives on this. So in terms of the pill, I think we all know probably, at least most of us or most of the listeners know somebody who got pregnant while they were on the pill or got pregnant like minutes after they came off the pill. So we all know it's possible to come off the pill and conceive right away. But when we look at what the research shows, there are studies that show that there is a overall a statistical delay in the time to conception. So there was one study that I cite in the Fifth Vital Sign, and what the researchers found was that they were comparing women who were using condoms, right, for birth control, so non-hormonal, and then they stopped, to women who were using a variety of different hormonal contraceptive methods. So some of the women were using the combined birth control pills, some of them were using the progesterone-only pill, some of them were using the IUD, the hormone-infused IUD, some of them were using the depot shot. And so what happened was when they compared how long it took these couples to conceive, the women who had been on the combined oral contraceptive pills took about twice as long. So the average time to conception was about 4 months or so for, couples that were using condoms, and then they stopped, versus 8 months or so for the women who were using oral contraceptives. And then, for the women, the depot shot is the worst offender. So I'm definitely not a fan of the depot shot. Of all of them, it's my least favorite. And the average time was somewhere between 15 to 18 months that it took to conceive. So FYI, the shot takes a lot longer to recover from. And so what's interesting is that this is often downplayed in the research because, they can just say, well, within a year, the conception rates are normal, so it's totally fine. But how this can play out for an individual woman is that we have been told our whole lives that we can get pregnant all the time. Mm-hmm. And so obviously, as soon as we come off the pill, we can say whatever we want, like words can come out of our mouth, but we are expecting to get pregnant immediately. And it's an emotional thing because many of us wait for years until the stars align, until we have the right person, the right partner, the right job, the right situation. And like, we are used to things like I order stuff on Amazon. My aunts are visiting me and they're from the West Indies. And it's like super cold. It's like snowing. It's your winter, right? Like it snowed like 2 feet yesterday. It's like crazy. So I ordered them winter jackets, right, on Amazon. And it came the next day. And they were like, what just happened? How is this here already? And so we're used to everything being instant, right? And so you think it's not a big deal if you read these research papers and like, oh, the fertility normalized and blah, 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 blah. But like month 1, you're probably kind of okay. You're like, sure, it's fine. Month 2, you're already freaking out a little. You might not be admitting it, but you're freaking out a little. Month 3, you might be at a doctor's office already getting fertility testing or trying to, and then being told that you have to wait, right? So how this plays out is that what this delay causes a lot of stress, anxiety for a lot of women. And interestingly, many women are on the fertility treatment train, within that first year, not knowing that it can take. So in separate research studies talk about, so there's different ways to look at how the pill impacts fertility. So one of them is the example I just gave, which is the kind of time to pregnancy studies, like how long it takes to actually get pregnant. Other studies look at how long it takes for the cycle parameters to normalize. So they kind of take the pregnancy question out of the equation, and they actually just look at the cycle itself. So there was a really interesting study that looked at a group of women who had never used contraceptives at all, and they kind of looked at their cycle parameters, and they compared them to another group of women who had recently come off of contraception. And in that study, what they found is that it took an average of about 9 to 12 I'm trying to remember if it was 9 to 12 cycles or months, but it took, I think it was cycles, an average of 9 to 12, because when I'm like picturing the study in my head, and what they had was they kind of had like the cycles, and the average length of the overall menstrual cycle. They had kind of the cervical mucus parameters, and they kind of looked at it from cycle to cycle to compare the two. And it took about 9 to 12 cycles before the post pill group, their parameters looked very similar to the never used pill group. And that is also really interesting because I tie that into the other example because it's like, okay, these women come off the pill, they expect to get pregnant right away. Sometimes, not all the time, it can take longer because remember, it's an average of 8 months. So some women would have gotten pregnant in 3 months or 6 months, but some women might not have been pregnant for 12 months or 14 months, right? And so by the time you're freaking out, that's just around the time that your cycles would be normalizing. So this is something that I don't share this information to scare women, but we need to understand how the pill works. And from my perspective, knowing this information means that when we do have a plan to conceive in the future, I highly recommend that if it's possible for you to consider to kind of reconsider your choice of contraception. Like if okay, me and my partner are planning to try to conceive in the fall, or we're going to start trying to conceive next year or whatever. I think that, my recommendation would be, consider if it could work for you and your partner to look at a non-hormonal option. So I'm suggesting come off the pill when you're still avoiding, just try to manage that fertility differently. I know you're terrified to come off the pill and you think you're going to get pregnant immediately. If you have the ability to do that, or if you can get your head around it, what it allows is it allows for your body to normalize. It allows for some of the effects of the pill to wear off. It doesn't mean you can't get pregnant because we don't need to have perfect cycles to get pregnant. But I believe in setting us up for the best possible outcome. Like I don't expect to get into a car accident, but we have insurance. And so it's like you don't expect to have an issue getting pregnant, but if you give yourself that time, then you're setting yourself up for success. Or if there is a problem and you come off the pill early, you actually have some time to address it. Like if you come off the pill and your period doesn't come back for 6 months, I mean, it's still super stressful, but way less stressful if you're not actively trying to conceive at the same time.
It's so fascinating that we're having this conversation because, again, as you mentioned, many women who do come off whatever hormonal contraception they've been on, they have this picture, this vision that they'll get pregnant straight away. And as you mentioned, it does happen to certain percentage of women, but sometimes it doesn't. And for those that it doesn't, they're trying to figure out why, and they think there's something wrong with them. But we know factual, it takes longer than, 1-3 months. Sometimes it takes even 12 months for someone to conceive. And I think that's where that patience game comes in as well. And being able to, as you said, assess where you're at in terms of your health and fertility, doing the fertility awareness side of things, having those conversations with your partner. So it's so beautiful to have more of an understanding of like why this is actually happening. So that way, you'll be able to have a healthier fertility around it. And you also mentioned a really good point about those who are planning on wanting to get pregnant, and the fact of that fear setting in their mind, because I've seen that a lot with women. They're like, oh no, I'm not going to get off the pill because like I will get pregnant. Or another case is they have been pregnant and then they decide to go back onto the pill. Have you seen that?
Of course, I think, I mean, the fear is real because we're programmed with it. And so I was graduating high school around the year 2000, and I think that the landscape has changed quite a bit. I feel like maybe the drug companies have had a more significant influence or something like that, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and that meant that it was like the AIDS era. So in that era, it was condoms, 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 condoms. So I came out of high school believing that condoms were effective. We learned that condoms were 98% effective, that and I didn't actually think that they didn't work. And these days, I feel like women are coming out with the impression that they're really not good and they don't work. I'm not like trying to say I'm not trying to be program. I'm just giving it as an example, because really like these days it feels like the understanding or the impression is that we need to have the hormones for sure, like that's like a given, and then the condoms are like an extra, but we are trained not to think that they're going to work. And it's interesting because this this whole concept of the pill being empowering and like feminism and stuff like that. And I'm not anti-pill. I think we should have all the options, just to clarify, because as soon as, people start to get all, comfortable. But I'm not anti-pill. I think we should just know the side effects. It's kind of like, why can't we just tell women what it does to them? Why can't we just tell them that these side effects are there? Because everybody doesn't experience the same side effects. I've spoken to plenty of women who didn't really notice anything and had a positive experience on it. But when you don't, where do you go to find your information? Because the most common response that I've seen is like midnight Googling. That's where, like, when we're desperate because we've been having these panic attacks for months and we don't understand why. And in a desperate night of Googling, you find that, oh, it could be related to my pill. Or you're having gallbladder attacks of all the random, and you have no idea. I've had a couple of women on the podcast who had their gallbladders removed because of the pill. And again, who knew that was a side effect, right? So that's kind of the point here. Like, we just need to know our options, right?
And I love the fact that you also mentioned that it is an option before the haters come at you and be like, so forth. But it's true. It's like it's being conscious enough to know, like, these are the facts, these are the side effects. It's your choice to whether you go down that path or not. And like you said, it's dependent on the person. It's dependent on how comfortable you are doing what decision you make around that. So, but it's really cool to obviously have this conversation around to make women feel more comfortable about the fact that there are side effects associated with the contraception, whatever type of contraception is, but it's also very empowering to know that you can come off it and still be able to manage your fertility through fertility awareness and conceive if that's the goal, or just have a healthy menstrual cycle. Because again, many of us have had unhealthy menstrual cycles.
Well, and along those lines, I mean, there's a couple of, again, I think it's important to share this perspective. So I do think that when you are in that stage where that you're possibly or actively planning to start a family within the next little while, I do think it's important to reconsider your choice of contraception. And I think that it does make sense for if it, well, I can't tell you if it makes sense for you, but I think that you should strongly consider a non-hormonal method during that 6 to 12 months prior to when you're planning to conceive, to give your body right. And it's interesting is that I've spoken to a number of women who intuitively feel that, to the point that they make a phone call and book an appointment with their doctor. And I always say it this way. I'm like, wait a minute. So you felt strongly enough about this concept of, like, maybe I should give my body a break, that you booked an appointment with your doctor, you took a shower, put on your clothes, left your house, probably got in your car or transit, went all the way to your doctor's office. And many of the times the doctors are saying, oh, no, that's not necessary. Just go off it when you want. So I find that interesting in two ways. One, your intuition was strong enough for you to do all of that, because I don't make an appointment to my doctor and put on my clothes for no reason. And I'm pretty sure you don't either. Mm-hmm. And secondly, who told you needed to ask your doctor's permission? It's so weird. Just like it's so interesting how we're so trained to think that if I'm going to come off the pill, I have to ask my doctor first. I mean, talk to your doctor for sure, but you don't need your doctor's permission. Like, you can inform your doctor, you can have a conversation with your doctor, you can talk about the pros and cons, like, you can express your concerns and everything. Permission, though, to come off of the pill is not something that you actually need from your doctor. So that's something that I find to be interesting, because I think many of us on some level question that. Because anyone who's been on the pill, including myself, for a period of time, you get to the point where you're like, I wonder what my real cycles are like. Because you don't know. And this is the whole point, right? So this is why it does make sense to consider, but you have to have a backup plan, because I'm suggesting that you are coming off when you are still actively avoiding, so that you actually have some time, so that you give your body some time so you can kind of see the lay of the land, see what's going on. And also, if you do need to have some support, that you have some time to do that before the pressure is really on. And the other thing to consider is just, in the book, I say something to the effect of, like, when we get into our 30s, we should also start reevaluating our method of birth control. I think that a lot of us make decisions for ourselves in our early 20s and our late teens. And those decisions just keep carrying on because we don't actively reevaluate them. So while you might have handled an unplanned pregnancy in a certain type of way when you were 17, and now you're kind of still acting like you're still 17, now you're like 32. So maybe it's time to have a conversation with yourself. Maybe the way you're handling it is completely fine and you're still okay with it, but you should still reevaluate. I mean, there's a lot of things I did in my 20s that maybe I shouldn't do now. Like maybe we should just have those conversations with ourselves, right? One thing that the reason why I say this, why it's really important to consider is, again, if we go back to the research that I mentioned, if it takes an average of 9 to 12 cycles, not months, for the cycles to normalize post pill, if you're 35 and you come off, do you have a year? Like if you were on depot, it was 18 months, so or more, so the other factor that we have to consider is, as we get older, we don't have the luxury of endless time for our bodies to recover. So it becomes even more crucial from my perspective just to start having these conversations about what type of birth control. This isn't me saying the pill is good or bad or you should do this or that. It's literally just like, wouldn't you like someone to like warn you if there was potential danger down the road, And this is what I hope to do, right? Like, we should just be made aware because no one's telling you this stuff. I mean, I can pretty much guarantee that most of the listeners, no one has warned you about this possibility. And then when you're faced with it, the doctors, what do they have for you? Well, they have ovulation stimulating drugs like, letrozole, Femera, and IVF, right? Like that's, so I feel like maybe we could just look at our birth control options and start learning more about our cycles, because it really can set us up for success and help us to avoid some of those interventions.
Amen. I totally agree with that. I came off the pill when I was 26. And to be honest, that was probably a really good decision to do that, because I've noticed how over the years I was able to heal my unhealthy period. I suffered so many pains, where now at the age of 35, I'm like so thankful that I was able to do it back then and not suffer those consequences now. And again, as you mentioned, it comes down to that fear base of women coming off the pill. It's just like, well, if you're never going to come off it, you're never going to know. And when you do, and if it's at an older age, are you willing to sacrifice that? If someone's wanting to conceive and have a family, it's just like, well, you better start having that conversation with yourself and your body and noticing like what changes you need to make.
Well, and it's so interesting because in our culture being so kind of obsessed with, I mean, it makes sense because when we are in our 20s, I mean, our fertility is higher. So overall and theoretically and realistically, we are more likely to conceive, kind of thing. But I think the part of the conversation that's missing is that there is a shift in our fertility as we get older. So if we're conducting ourselves in the same way when we're 35 that we did when we were 21, without having that conversation about how fertility changes. So as we get older, the biggest factor in terms of egg quality and things of that nature is age. It was in the new book that we have coming out. That was like the one of the challenging sections to write, because we wanted to be honest about the aging, but we don't want to be negative about it. But you have to say it. I'm not of the opinion that we should be sugarcoating. Women get all the sugarcoating, right, from the medical establishment, and they don't necessarily get the true kind of facts. So I say this not to generalize, not to fearmonger. I mean, women can conceive at a variety of different ages, and it's, I've seen it myself. And but we should still be aware of the impact of aging, because then as we get older, as we get into our mid 30s and early 40s, we do want to be aware of some of the challenges so that we can adapt our diet, so that we can adapt our supplementation protocols to make sure that we are optimizing that egg quality, to make sure that we are talking to our partners. Because not always, but generally, as we get older, our partners tend to get older too. And
Mm.
although men make sperm, from puberty forward, age affects them too. There's an interesting piece of information. I find it fascinating. So the egg is super, super interesting. And one of the things that our eggs can do is that the egg itself can repair what they call sperm DNA damage. So, believe it or not, men's sperm aren't perfect. And and there's a lot of different factors that determine what makes optimal sperm for conception. But one of those factors is the level of sperm DNA damage or the level of kind of oxidation. When you think of oxidative stress or that concept of oxidation, I like to just picture the banana, like what happens when you peel a banana and let it sit there, it turns brown, and that's an example of oxidative stress. And as we get older, we're more susceptible to that. And so a lot of that kind of oxidative stress contributes to this whole conversation about quality, egg quality, sperm quality, things of that nature. And so what are a lot of the supplements, right, that are recommended if you are trying to support egg quality or sperm quality? Well, they're antioxidants because what happens if you dip the same banana in lemon water or something, right? Like it doesn't turn brown. So it's the same general concept. So what's interesting is that when we're younger, and there's studies that look at this stuff, it's crazy. When we're younger, our eggs have a greater capacity to repair his sperm DNA damage. So when the sperm meets the egg and we make the little tiny person, the egg has some degree of capacity to actually repair if his sperm has some kind of issue. But as we get older, we have a reduced capacity. So there's this whole thing around when we kind of know this. We kind of know that as we get older, we're more prone to some of the genetic issues or complications that come up, or we're more prone to miscarriage, or we're more prone to a reduction in our overall fertility. And so this is the conversation where we're so focused on, I'm going to get pregnant every day. Like the education system is so like, you got to prevent pregnancy at all costs, which is fine because I didn't want to get pregnant when I was 19 either. So I'm not saying this is all bad, but then at some point we have to shift that conversation because many of us do want to have babies at some point. So my view of, feminism and, all of these things together is that we should be able to do what we want to do. So if I want to prevent pregnancy, I should have the option to do that. And I should be aware of all of the ways I could do that. So the hormonal and the non-hormonal, so that I can choose what's best for me. And then when I actually want to have a baby, I should also have the option to do that. And I should be provided with the information to help me have an optimal chance and shot of that. We should be able to have both choices equally instead of more so being focused on the avoid part.
Yeah. Speaking of choices, because, as we were talking about the side effects of the birth control, going to the doctor, that fear mongering about birth control, the fear of like getting pregnant all the time. Something that I do see, and I would love for us to finish today's conversation, is with how can we find practitioners that will, well, okay, let me rephrase this. Can you share a few strategies of helping a woman to choose the right health practitioner when they're wanting to deal with either menstrual cycle issues or they're wanting to come off the contraception pill or birth control, whatever it is, and feel confident enough to do so? Because from my experience, and it's been multiple times where in my past, when I came off the pill, every practitioner that I went and saw said, don't go off it. You're young, you're sexually active, it will protect you. But that wasn't the reason why I was on it from the first place. It was literally managing my bad acne and heavy periods. It had nothing to do with me having sex. So then I came off it. And funnily enough, over the few years, I have been dealing a lot with more stress, and my menstrual cycle has been like, a little bit unregular. And the first thing that a practitioner said is, oh, just go back on the pill. And it's just like, you're not listening to me. You are not listening. So I would love to know like your input around this.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think that the first thing that's kind of tricky is when we start to get into this menstrual cycle knowledge and start to empower ourselves and chart our cycles and maybe come off birth control and see what's going on. You're kind of entering new territory. I think the first piece is understanding where the doctors are coming from, because this is one of the big challenges. Doing menstrual cycle charting, coming off the pill, working to improve your cycles naturally puts you kind of at odds with what they're doing in the healthcare system. I've interviewed a number of doctors over the years, and every time I got my hands on a doctor, I always wanted to know, like, okay, so what did he teach you in med school? Like, what's going on there? Like, why are you guys all saying the same thing about the pill and all this kind of stuff? And so, though I have not been into medical school, what I've gathered is that they really teach doctors in a very specific way. And that way is that all menstrual cycle issues, the solution for all of them is the pill. That really is. So they're taught about what a normal cycle looks like. And of course, they're taught about all kinds of, menstrual cycle problems and things like that. But ultimately, all roads lead to the pill. So it's the pill and painkillers for literally all things menstrual. And then in terms of actual birth control, not only are they encouraged to get women on the pill, but there's a push to have women on like they call them like long acting reversible contraceptives, but things like the IUD, things like the implant, things like the shot. And why? Because those have less of an opportunity for user error. So if you think about, what is the most effective method, right, for the general public, the most effective method is probably the one that you don't have to remember to do anything about. The one that you go once and you have it inserted and then it just protects you. So really the only failure there would be the actual failure of the unit itself. And that failure rate is relatively small. So what I've gathered also is that doctors are trained in such a way that if efficacy is kind of prized over everything. Now, it might seem strange to think, well, shouldn't it be? But many women find that their mental health or their, not wanting to experience all these side effects can actually trump efficacy. Like, because not to say that you should use a method that's not effective, but I mean, first of all, hormonal contraceptive options are generally not like there's subtle differences in the efficacy, but most of them are similarly effective, right? Like most of them are in the 99 somewhere when used correctly. Like, so whether it's the IUD or the implant or the pill, right, or the shot, there are differences, and there are differences, especially with typical use versus, but overall, they're similar in effectiveness. I think I think I can make that statement without pissing off too many people. So then ultimately, what is going to make the difference between what I choose or what one woman chooses versus another? So they're taught to put that efficacy over everything. And so if efficacy was over everything, we'd all be on the implant because the implant actually shows the highest efficacy. But I mean, there's plenty of so when you come in and you say, you know what, I've taken this pill, that pill, the other pill, I even had an IUD, but I actually didn't respond well to that. I had, depression, anxiety, and I lost my libido, and I'm really looking for another option. Some doctors might be not impressed by that because they might just say, well, just try a different one. You didn't try this brand. You didn't try that brand, because in their mind, efficacy trumps everything. But for some of us, we're obviously going to choose something else. We might choose condoms. We might choose not to be on the pill, right? So to go back to your question of choosing a practitioner, the first thing is to really understand where they're coming from. So to give a silly analogy, like if I were to go to McDonald's and, I drive my car up to the door or whatever, and I go to the cash and I'm like, hey, I need you to change my oil. They're like, dude, this is McDonald's. Can I get you a burger? No, you need to change my oil. And I get pissed off and I'm like causing a scene. Like they call the cops. Someone's recording me. I'm on Instagram, right? Live. This crazy chick is asking for an oil change at McDonald's. So we don't want to be that crazy chick at the doctor's office asking for holistic health advice and asking them to help us to change our diet and asking them to look at our menstrual cycle charts, because that's not what they do there. The medical doctors were not trained to interpret your menstrual cycle chart, and you can ask them, maybe not your doctor, you don't want to piss them off in your appointment, but if you ever have an opportunity to talk to, these medical health professionals, medical doctors are not nutritionists, you know, so they didn't have a lot of training on nutrition in school, and they're not really trained in this manner. So the first thing is to really understand that when you're going to your doctor, that is what they're going to do. And I think anyone who has had any menstrual problems, who has gone to any physician, can attest that, because that's what they do there. When you go and you say, I have heavy periods, I have painful periods, I have X problem with my period, I have irregular cycles, etc., etc., etc. The answer is, let's put you on the pill. Have you tried the IUD? Oh, I've got an IUD, or I've got an implant for you. That's how they're trained. So then what do we do? I think that, well, what I typically share with my clients is this concept of a team approach. So I call it the boardroom analogy, where you picture yourself at the head of the boardroom table, and your doctor should be there, because we all need doctors. I'm not anti-doctor, but we have to be fair to that doctor. We can't expect the doctor to jump on their head and do all kinds of circus acts when that's not what they went to school for. So in addition to your doctor, if you're having period issues or specific challenges, you may have to also consider a functional medicine doctor, a naturopathic doctor. Some of us might have an acupuncturist. Some of us might have a chiropractor. Some of us might have a health coach. Some of us might have a fertility awareness charting instructor. There's different, you know, some of us might have a nutritionist. So that's something to think about. So my suggestion is to stop relying on the medical doctor for things outside of their scope. Start thinking about that concept of who can really support me. Consider a functional doctor. If it's a medical doctor, typically they have trained as a medical doctor, but they've also taken additional training outside of their training in medicine, in functional medicine, which is more of that root cause of medicine, where they're looking for the, you know, underlying factor and potentially looking to help you and support you in that way. But it's not just good enough to just pick a naturopath and just go. I think further to that, if you're dealing with a specific issue with your thyroid, or you're dealing with a specific issue with your menstrual cycle, your hormones, you've got PCOS, if possible, you should also look to see if you can find somebody who specializes in the condition that you have. So after years of doing interviews and things, there's a big difference between more of a generalist and someone who really has taken a special interest in whatever it is. If you go to someone who has written a book on the thyroid, who has multiple blogs, or, you know, primarily focuses their practice on that, you're going to get a different experience when you seek support for your thyroid than a generalist who maybe does far less of those in a year. So some practical suggestions, I would say, you know, ask around. It's so funny with doctors. Like if I'm looking for a hairdresser, I remember there was this girl, and she always had really nice hair, and I was like, who does your hair? This is logical. But for whatever reason, when we are looking for, you know, health professionals, we don't often think to do that. Even doing an internet search, I get these DMs all the time. It's like, you know, do you know a doctor in Seattle? No, I don't have a list of all the doctors in every single place. For some reason, we don't think to search in our local area, you know, whatever it is. And so I would say those two pieces of information could be a great starting point. And just remember that you can interview your doctors. These days, so many people have blogs and information. You can stalk them a little online and find out what they specialize in, what jazzes them up. And even just doing those few things, you'll come up with a short list to start with that you didn't have before.
So useful. Wow. I wish we had that information back in 2000.
Right?
You know, it would have saved us so much time. You also made such a pivotal point around we need to stop taking or expecting holistic health help from a medical doctor. And it makes so much sense, because most of us are going on this healing journey, wanting to go more of the natural way, but we're not realizing we're hitting a wall and keep bashing our head against it, going, I want your help, doctor, but you're not giving it to me. It's just like, hold on a second, let's take a step back. They're here to medicate us. It's a completely different way of looking at it. So I absolutely admire that view, and I hope a lot of the listeners will have that light bulb moment going, okay, something needs to change.
Yeah. It's so interesting because you don't think of it that way. And I'm very careful to teach my clients this to the best of my ability, because what happens, and it's predictable, You start charting your cycles, you feel so empowered. You have so much more knowledge about your body. You finally figured out that, oh my gosh, when I eat that thing, that's what causes this other thing. And I can see it in my chart. And you're so excited that you take your chart to your doctor's office and you're like, see? And they're like, you may as well, I mean, because I'm not a medically trained physician, it would be the same as like you get your EKG from your doctor when you get your heart levels tested. Like you can see how little I know about EKGs, right? And then you show it to me and you're like, look at my EKG. And it's like, you
Oh,
may as well have drawn a picture of Santa Claus with ice cream. Like I can't help you with this thing. Can you go to your doctor, please, and ask them to do it? And so literally that's what we're doing, but we don't realize that's what we're doing, right? When we
mm,
try to get that support. And this is not negating doctors. We just have to go to when we go to someone who has specialized in a modality, we need to make sure that we are gearing our questions. So
yeah.
for example, if you have concerns about something that's going on, maybe before you even go to your doctor, you should be thinking like, what is the outcome that I want? Maybe what you need from that doctor is a requisition form for, XYZ testing, right? So instead of trying to convince your doctor that your menstrual cycle chart is a valid way, like, right? Maybe you should be focused on like, what do I want? Like when I leave this appointment, like what is the goal here? And get the goal, focus on that.
I love that. Speaking of goals, we obviously have the goal of publishing your book very, very soon. Um, would you be able to give our listeners a little bit of a tease of what it's about?
Yes, well, thank you for that. So the new book is Real Food for Fertility. And I'm really excited about this book. It is a book that I co-authored with my dear friend and colleague, Lily Nichols, who's a registered dietitian. And so it's essentially this perfect marriage, at least in my opinion, of fertility nutrition as well as fertility awareness, so that we can really empower women to take both of these extremely important pieces of optimizing your fertility and put them together. So I was joking as we were writing it. It's like her book and my book wrote a baby or had a baby, because she wrote Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and I wrote the fifth vital sign. And so everything that we're talking about today is essentially in that book. And it's really our goal with the book is to prepare you for conception, for that preconception period, so that even if you're not actively trying to conceive right now, we want you to be thinking about that 6 to 12 month or more period of time before you start to try to have a baby, so that you can really optimize not only your cycles and your fertility, but your nutrition, so that when you're ready to have a baby, we've really set you up for success. So for more information and details, you can go to realfoodforfertility.com. And when you go there, you'll find all the links that you need. You can check out the first chapter for free. We had so many citations because Lily and I, we are, when we put out information, we really believe strongly that we need to be backing it up with the data. So it's not a fluffy book. We back everything we're saying with data. And we had so many citations that we had to include it as a separate PDF download, because I don't think that any of us wanted to print like 2,400 citations at the back of the book. So rest assured, have some comfort in knowing that it's an evidence-based book. We're releasing it on Valentine's Day, which is super fun as well.
Ah, so good. A perfect present and a gift for all the women to buy themselves the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, and something else that I'll mention as well is that, as the years have passed, one of my most favorite projects that I've been working on is training practitioners now to teach their clients to chart their cycles and also to use their menstrual cycle as a vital sign. So I've created an incredible ebook, a free ebook for practitioners. And it's called How to Teach Your how to Interpret Virtually Any chart that your client throws at you. And so I wanted to share that as well for your audience, for any practitioners that are listening. And you can find that resource at fertilityfriday.com/chart. So really easy to remember.
Super easy. And I'll make sure to put that in the showcase notes so they'll have access to download it straight away. Lisa, pardon me, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today. It has been an absolute pleasure having a better understanding and more in depth about how for us to move forward healthily and holistically and managing our menstrual cycle. And I know a lot of our listeners are going to be super grateful for you jumping on and, sharing your wisdom.
Well, thank you so much. You asked great questions and we had such a great chat today. So I'm really glad we were able to get together.
Me too. Me too. Well, girls, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please make sure that you share it, screenshot it, tag Lisa, tag myself. And then till next time, let's dive deeper into your vital sign.